Thanks for joining us today. I'm Sydney Fellows, and I'm glad to introduce this second training session on organic certification for wild harvested crops. So I'll start by giving a brief introduction to provide context for this training. Then I will introduce my organization and today's speaker. So this 201 training follows the 101 wild crop training that our organization, the Northwest Center for Alternatives to Pesticides, hosted this past summer with Matthew Molyneaux. That first training laid out the basics of the wild crop certification process. It explored what it means to certify a wild crop as organic, what the general process of wild crop certification looks like, and of course, all the terms such as wild crop. Those terms were defined there. Matthew will review some of these definitions and basic concepts of the certification to get us all on the same page today. And I'll introduce Matthew here in a moment. So that 101 training is available to watch on YouTube, and in our follow-up email to you all after this training, we'll provide you with that link in addition to any other links that may be mentioned in today's training. Next, to introduce the Northwest Center for Alternatives to Pesticides, also called NCAP. NCAP began in 1977 with a group of concerned citizens who worked to shift forest management practices in the Pacific Northwest. Today, our organization works to protect both community and environmental health by advocating for the adoption of ecologically responsible solutions to reduce pesticide usage. NCAP has a diverse approach that encompasses education, organizing, outreach, technical assistance, and policy advocacy. We operate across Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Western Montana, and Northern California, and we are at the forefront of efforts to transition away from toxic pesticides, particularly within communities that are disproportionately impacted by pesticide exposure, including people employed as migrant and seasonal field workers, and people living in and around agricultural fields. Because of the wild crop certification's focus on organic practices, this training focus aligns well with NCAP's vision. We are privileged to have Matthew Molyneaux join us today. He is a technical specialist with Oregon Tilth and will discuss the specifics of the organic certification processes for crops harvested from the so-called wild. This session aims to foster collaboration and knowledge exchange to support the adoption of organic wild crop harvesting practices. By understanding the details of organic certification for wild harvested crops, you will be better equipped to guide producers in maintaining the integrity of their harvesting practices and the health of the ecosystems that they help manage. Lastly, a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, and we will send out a link to the recording along with any resources mentioned during the presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat to reach out either to me or Caitlin Parks, who is on the NCAP Zoom account, and we're on standby to assist you. And last, we encourage you to stay engaged throughout this training by using the chat. Your participation is what makes these events so valuable. We will save any questions for the end of the presentation. And at that point, we'll begin the Q&A portion of the training. So without further ado, we'll get started. And Matthew, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thanks, Sydney. I appreciate that nice introduction. That was Awesome. Well, let me work on queuing up my screen share here, and we will get started with the slideshow. Okay, great. It looks like the participants can see my screen. Great. Well, thanks everyone. Let me just get my view tuned up here a little bit. There we go. Okay, well, welcome again, everyone, to the Oregon Tilth and NCAP Wild Crop 201 training. My name is Matthew Molyneaux, and I am a technical specialist at Oregon Tilth. I've been an organic inspector for over 15 years, and I've inspected every crop type you can imagine, traveling to 23 states. I've done some wild crop inspections in southern Arizona and northeast Washington, right near the Canadian border and right near the border with Mexico as well. So, speaking to the vast range of some of these crops that we'll be encountering in this scope of certification. I'm happy today to share some of my experience and guidance around this unique topic of certified organic wild crops. So I did want to thank NCAP today for inviting me here as a second follow-up training on this topic of organic wild crops. Part of this partnership is funded through TOPP, T-O-P-P. So we'll talk more about that on the last slide of today. And this program encourages new certified organic producers to enter the marketplace. Part of the TOPP program, there's a mentorship that links existing farmers or producers with new and upcoming producers, as well as technical support and resources and other funding opportunities available. So if you become part of this program and achieve organic certification, just know that that TOPP resource super valuable, and we'll take a look more at the end of the presentation today as well. So I'll give a quick minute here. I'm getting some notifications of some new folks entering the room, and we're about to dive into that content. And so just want to make sure everyone is on board after these introductory slides. Okay, so what will we cover today? Well, we'll do a brief recap of the previous training, and we'll dive a little deeper into developing the OSP, or Organic System Plan. This is part of the application process where you describe your practices in detail for the certifier to evaluate. Think of it kind of like a playbook that should contain everything from start to finish for your organic operation. We will talk about preparing to become certified and the necessary records to have in order. We will also discuss preparing for your first inspection and what to do after certification is achieved, and the ongoing record keeping requirements throughout the year. You may have heard already that being organic is a lot of paperwork. While this is true that organic certifiers rely on accurate and detailed record keeping, once you develop your own personal system to keep records, the burden is really not too difficult, as you would keep these kind of records for any business enterprise. So that is kind of an overview of today, and let's get into it here. So this training is going to overlap to some degree with the first training. However, I'm going to focus more on the specifics of certification this time around. There is a recording link, as Sydney mentioned, to the previous training. So for those that were not able to attend and wanted to get skilled up that way, that resource will be available. And I'm going to cover now a few of the questions that came up after that last training that I did attempt some answers at, but we'll dig a little deeper into those now. So the first point here on the right, upon achieving certification, it's important to note that the crops you are applying for can become certified organic from the locations or harvest sites that you've identified and are verified to be compliant. That does not mean the entire site is certified organic for any other users or any other types of crop production activities. So this is a different aspect than the crop scope certification, which would occur, in an agricultural setting. So the wild crop certification applying to the crops more so than the entire land being certified, because of course other users thinking about federally managed lands, national forest, etc. Important distinction I just wanted to address there. Looking to the second point, what is the market potential for certified organic? So thinking about these wild harvested items, it is kind of a nuance. It's sort of a weird outlying aspect to organic certification. Well, many herbal product manufacturers do purchase bulk quantities of ingredients, such as those harvested from the wild. While some may only carry the wild harvested designation, many of those ingredients are also certified organic. So any further manufacturers are required to use certified organic ingredients in their herbal preparations, teas, body care products, etc. So you should inquire with potential buyers to determine if organic certification is best for your market. Also keep in mind local buyers like chefs, grocery retailers may also have interest in certified organic wild crops, such as mushrooms, seasonal edibles, and flavorings or ingredients. The last question I have over on the right, I don't really have a direct answer to, but I believe it does deserve further consideration. So will organic certification lead to overharvesting or commodification of culturally important crops? Some of you may know, if you've done any wild harvesting, this is hard work. So to get out into these remote areas, harvest large quantities of crops, takes physical work, logistics, and planning all before the sale happens. The role of organic certifiers is to verify harvesters are harvesting in a manner that ensures that such harvesting or gathering will not be destructive to the environment and will sustain the growth and production of the wild crop. In essence, employing sustainable practices that leave enough behind to naturally regenerate. That said, we are only on site once per year and rely on producers to follow the rules. When we're auditing records, we also look at yields and discuss how much was harvested from which areas. While some plants are endangered or at risk, we ask applicants to identify if and where these plants may exist in their harvest area, and that their practices do not negatively impact these sensitive areas or lead to over-harvesting plants that are not abundant in a particular area. This is a long answer, I know, but I just wanted to address some of the concerns around that topic and where the certifier's role is in assessing that. And so we'll move on from here. So what is a wild crop? We'll start here with the definition, the top of the page. There are some important points to consider when discussing what qualifies as a wild crop, as seen here on the slide. Organic certification requirements describe practices that are allowed and not allowed. There are two particular areas where we can turn to the rules on this, the citation listed above at 205, 207, along with the NOP handbook section 5022. So these are key resources to study and learn the program requirements you will be adhering to become certified. I did provide some links to the moderators if it's helpful to find them that way rather than just a blanket search for those terms. But those are really the rules that we have to lean on to understand the wild crop scope certification and how to best assess that as certifiers. So I just incorporated 3 bullet points here on the slide below the definition. I'll just kind of touch on those briefly now. So mentioned in the previous slide that the harvesting or gathering shall not be destructive to the environment and will sustain the growth and production of the wild crop that you're targeting. And so management practices beyond those specified in this handbook section 5022 are an indicator of crop production, thus requiring crop certification. So here we have a split between what's certified organic crop and how that differs from wild crop. So really any management activities, fertilizing, shade cloth, irrigation, none of that would be allowed in a wild crop setting. So those are all crop production activities. And then the third point here speaks to your harvest crew. So you may have a lead person for this certified operation, and they're going to seasonally employ some harvesters. We want to make sure those harvesters are trained and are adhering to the system plan and the producer's program. So unmanaged, untrained, and uninformed harvesting of wild products from a wild habitat without maintaining or improving the natural resources can disqualify the wild products from organic certification. So this is cut and paste text right out of that handbook section 5022. So really gives us something beyond that standard citation to inform our process of evaluating a producer's practices. So the next two slides, we'll turn to the organic system plan. So we've defined the standards and we have some context for these practices. So how do we do this to become certified organic? Creating an organic system plan, or OSP, is required of all certified operations. This plan will document all of your practices and is part of the application process. Many sections of a basic crop OSP do not apply to wild crop operations, as they include management practices I touched on earlier, such as fertility and pest control. The sections of the OSP that do apply to wild crop, I have a few identified here on the slide. So we'd start out with general site information. Here we will need verification that the harvest sites are free from prohibited materials for at least 36 months preceding harvest. We will also need maps that clarify the harvest areas and borders or buffer zones, and we'll touch on more on that in a little bit here. You'll also include your general business information, name, address, etc. So kind of step one. Another section of the OSP that applies particularly to this, natural resources and biodiversity. So this is a part of every crop producer's OSP, and this is part of what makes organic unique in this certification program. So these practices will be described in conserving resources, including habitat, enhancing biodiversity of their site. And so thinking of this in a typical farm setting where perhaps they're growing a certified organic monocrop, they would need to incorporate things like hedgerows, pollinator plants, cover crops, or other practices. Now for wild crops, we look at potential impacts on soil and water quality, erosion concerns, or impacts on other species that might be present in the harvest area. And of course, harvest practices. So this part of all crop producer organic system plans are going to be unique and specific for wild crop folks. You'll also describe any post-harvest handling activities in this part of the system plan. So generally, simple drying is allowed, thinking about post-harvest activities, and other activities may be considered handling. And so this is an additional scope of certification. So this is where your certifier will assess. You're going to describe your practices, how the crop is going to get from the wild or the field, in the case of a crop producer, to the marketplace, and all the steps in between. So just being aware, and we'll touch more on a certifier's role here in a little bit, where your harvest practices end and your post-harvest handling begins, some assessment will be made to verify you're just a wild crop producer and not, in fact, a handler or processor. Packaging and labeling, just touched on that briefly. If you have a particular way you package or type of packaging that occurs, you'll want to disclose all that as well. So this could be bulk harvest bins, totes, bags, and no retail packaging. That's easy. You're taking your crop from the wild, selling it in bulk, but there may be still some organic labeling required in transportation to identify this harvested item as organic on these bulk non-retail containers. So I would encourage you to review some organic system plan blank forms or look at certifier websites for more details. So continuing on with the organic system plan, contamination prevention. This is a part, again, of all producers' plans. In a wild crop setting, unique considerations exist here. Thinking about roadside herbicide spraying or aerial spraying, or even fire retardant that might have been applied to an area. The example I give here is that morel mushrooms may not be able to be harvested from a burn area if that area was treated until this 3 years or 36 months have lapsed. So being aware of what's gone on in these wild areas is super important, and you assessing whether these areas are comply with the ability to be certified organic, or if there's been a change to their status in the time that you've used these sites for harvesting. So it's important to be able to identify these sources, or the other example I give is point source pollution in aquatic areas. So is your harvest area well away from potential sources of contamination? You will describe this in your OSP and on a map. Also thinking about shared harvest containers or bins or vehicle storage areas. Are these cleaned prior to contact with your organic crops? This is another potential source of cross-contamination. So you're really describing in your plan all of the practices that could potentially impact the integrity of your organic items. And of course, record keeping. So it all comes down to the records. Detailed harvest and sales records are required of all certified operations and will be thoroughly audited. Inspectors will conduct an audit of detailed dates and quantities of harvest, all transportation records, shipping, bills of lading, weight slips, etc. If any of those are applicable to your operation, we'll look to evaluate those and reconcile your harvested quantities with sales records over a given time period. This is where we talk about evaluating yields as well, which can be challenging in a wild crop setting as harvest areas may be vast and quantities may be small. On the flip side, they can be substantial. I've inspected some operations that wild harvest, tens of thousands of pounds a year of different crops from, tens of thousands of acres spanning throughout the state. So it can be a rather large operation as well. The Oregon Tilth version of the OSP has a specific section called the W1 that captures the details specific to this wild crop standard. Other certifiers may require a detailed narrative on your practices in those other sections we've touched on here above. So this will vary depending on your certifier, and I wanted to give a note here on certification in general, just to give you some background and some context. So the USDA maintains oversight on all certification agencies that actually conduct the certification work. So these agencies are accredited and also audited and tasked with implementing program changes and ensuring compliance of all of their certified operations. So whichever certifier you choose, there are state agencies in Idaho, Washington State, for example. There are several in California that do certification work. They may have specific requirements for the OSP relative to wild crop certification. So be sure to review and understand those, but being aware that they're all under one umbrella standard, which is the National Organic Program. Okay, so check my time here. So additional OSP requirements. So I kind of touched on some of these, but some specific nuances for wild crop applicants. It's pretty unique, and honestly, there are not too many certified operations relative to other scopes like crops, livestock, processing, and handling. Wild crop represents a relatively small segment of certified organic. There are some additional details you will need to describe we touched on earlier, but the map is a crucial piece of information to describe your harvest areas. You will also need to submit in advance to being inspected and certified your current permits or verification of your rights or permission to harvest from the area you are seeking certification for. Third point here, you may also need to submit examples of what we call audit trail documents. So these would be examples of your current harvest records, transportation or processing records, if applicable, and sales records. So some certifiers require of new applicants you to demonstrate to us how you keep records so we know you're able to keep those and comply with the program requirements ahead of time. So certification timeline. I've got got a little error on my text there. Greatly depends on certifier availability and other factors. So we're going to talk through a typical certification timeline. It does vary widely, depending on your certifier and what time of year you apply. Another factor to consider is availability of a qualified inspector in your region or able to travel there. So I'm going to encourage you folks to apply as early as possible. Let me click through this here. There we go. So we'll start with the application process. Begin early, start now. If you plan to apply next year, do some research now. You can start by visiting a website of a certifier of your choice and see what these blank OSP, Organic System Plan forms and application look like. So you're going to download those or request a hard copy, get them filled out, start working up your answers. Remember to include as much detail as possible in your OSP to describe all of your practices or what you plan to do. Maybe you're brand new and haven't really done this before. You want to describe your plan of where you're going to go, what you're going to do, how you would harvest, handle, and sell these wild crops. So once the application is complete, you'll have to submit a fee to begin the process, which will vary again by certifier. I'm just going to give the range of usually around $300 to $500. You're submitting your application fee, getting your line in the queue set up. So you'll hear back once it's received. And the goal here with that complete OSP is that they don't hit you up after and say, we need more information. We need you to answer page 3 of this and page 11. Question B needs more clarification. You want to have as much detail at the outset as you can to provide all that information so that it doesn't delay the process. So let's see. And then soon you would hear back from an inspector to, once your application and your OSP is approved, it's moved on to scheduling for inspection. And ultimately the inspector will come out and verify your site is compliant, your practices are accurate to your OSP, what you say you're doing, and you're aware of the record keeping requirements and the NOP standards to which your operation will be held. So we'll talk a bit more about inspection here in the following slide, but just wanted to outline this certification timeline. So the inspector will turn in their report. It will be reviewed. Boom. It will be reviewed by a final reviewer, usually someone different than the initial reviewer, who will make that certification decision. So the goal of a complete OSP and records produced at inspection is to avoid any delays or follow-up that may be necessary. So having some examples of your records at inspection is going to be really helpful. They can conduct those audits. They can verify you are keeping records or you're capable of complying, and it'll just help solidify your operation and that review process and certification. So you can see here I broadly identified January to August. You may get it done in 90 days or 120 days. That would be awesome. But if there's a lot of follow-up and back and forth, it could delay things. And on future slides here, we'll talk about some of those details. So let's talk about inspection day. Planning for your inspection will involve communication with your inspector. Again, wild crops being so unique in that you may have one harvest area that's not very big, that's easy to get to, or there could be several. It could be half an hour on a dirt road and hard to get to. So we need to consider all of that in scheduling. Decide if you'll drive in separate cars or if you will need to drive. Determine the best time to visit the sites. Where crop areas are accessible and the weather is favorable. So if you're harvesting in areas that are under snow 6 months of the year, you want to plan your inspection not during that time so the inspector can see some of the crop you intend to harvest. They'll ask questions and confirm your map and OSP statements are accurate. You're going to describe your harvest practices and how the crops get from your site to the marketplace. So walk them through this process. And so when you meet, you'll want to decide on a meeting location, if the inspector will want to review your records first or visit the sites first. This could be in your home or a garage or somewhere else. Ideally, you'll have examples of these records. So if you've done this in the past, not organic, conventional wild crops, you'll want to have those record examples available, and they'll audit those records as part of the inspection process. Any areas you might wash, dry, package, or store crops will also be part of your certification and will need to be inspected. So again, if that's in a garage, in your yard, that's part of your certification. Inspector is going to want to look there. If you have any off-site storage areas, maybe you contract cold storage, frozen storage somewhere else, that may or may not be inspected. All that's part of your OSP, and your inspector certifier will verify what exactly will need to happen on inspection day. Is there any current inventory of last year's crops? Maybe you have some dried root stored up that won't be organic, so it will need to be designated as non-organic in your records and segregated from the current year's crop. So these are just some examples of detailed questions that will be asked, and the inspection will then conclude with an exit interview. The inspector will recap the inspection findings, asking any additional questions, and record any areas of potential concern or more information needed. So remember, the purpose of the inspection and certification is to verify what you've reported in your OSP is consistent with the activities in the field or your facility, observations, and records that are reviewed, and that all of these practices are compliant with the NOP standards. Okay, so post-inspection, what to expect here. You've completed your OSP, you've sent in the application, you've had your first organic inspection, and now you'll wait for the certification decision. I say keep the communication open. Feel free to ask your certifier the projected timeline for review of your file. They may not nail down a specific answer, but at least you're keeping that communication open. Will there be any additional costs? Will you have to pay that inspection cost right after inspection or after you achieve certification? It may be handled differently, but be aware that there may be additional costs, there will be, involved for that inspection fee. Be attentive to your phone or email messages. If you get a request and you don't check it for a week and then send it back, it may be a week before they respond to that email. And so here's where timing is of the essence, and we want to be prompt in replying to our certifier. If this process drags out and you're coming up close to harvest, there are some other considerations about pending for your crop harvest. So here we get to where we're crossing over and why I'm advocating for an early application. You're having to make business decisions. So if you can't get certified in time and your crop needs to get harvested, the mushrooms are going to freeze or they're going to dry up, you might need to get out there, harvest them, and sell that year as non-organic because you haven't achieved certification in time. I've seen this scenario many times. So you're waiting for your organic certificate, but that organic sale can literally occur the following day. So lining up your harvest and certification, as I've just been touching on, can be tricky. And you want to make sure to keep records throughout. So you've applied, you've been inspected. If you go out and do any activities, if you hack back some blackberries around your target species, keep records of those activities because you're still pending certification. But if you're engaged in any scouting activities, monitoring, you want to make records of that in your logs so that you have this trail started. And once you've received your certificate, make sure that it's accurate. It lists all crops you're intending to certify. You can't sell anything as organic if it's not listed on that certificate. The Organic Integrity Database, or OID, is a clearinghouse that has all certified organic operations certificates. So this is a change this year from the USDA National Organic Program, and you can search this Organic Integrity Database, anyone can, to find other producers that are doing wild crops, for example, and that's where your certificate will be housed. So now you're certified. I just mentioned keeping detailed records of all activities. Perhaps you're monitoring for new areas or new crop types or any other general activities that are good to keep records on. There are some required elements of record keeping for wild crops, and that's primarily harvest and sales records. Can't stress this enough. So detailed harvest and sales records are required. We want to have the date, the location, which crops, and quantity harvested. So you have names for your sites or your areas. You'll list that in the OSP. You want to have as much detail as you can in those harvest activities and in your post-harvest handling. So this quantity, sometimes it's hard to estimate from the field or from the hills how much you brought down. You had 4 totes in the back of the pickup. They're roughly 100 pounds each. You do want to assign some kind of quantity either at harvest or when you get back to unload, so you have a measurable unit that can be audited. And that same measure of quantity could follow through all sales records. So if you're harvesting in pounds, you want to be selling in pounds. If you harvest by boxes and you sell by boxes, that's up to you, as long as it stays consistent and is measurable and identifiable on the records. The last section here, report any changes to your OSP as soon as possible. So this goes without saying in the certification world, but in general, if you're trying to add a new site or add a new crop or some new process, you want to report that change before you implement it. So that organic system plan can be amended really at any time of the year. We want it to capture all of your practices in as much detail as possible. So when changes occur or new practices occur, get that section updated, send it along to your certifier. And so here's some examples of crops and some handling, and we're getting to the tail end here. There are many types of wild crops that are common to the Pacific Northwest or Intermountain West. The important part is to list all crop types in your OSP, as they should be listed on your certificate. Are you harvesting red huckleberries or black huckleberries? OSHA root or Oregon graperoot? These details are important to be considered across all of your records. So we don't want to just put we're harvesting berries. We need to be specific in our varieties for marketing and on that certificate. These details are important to be consistent. I already said that across all records. So the next step is being sure your post-harvest handling is described in the OSP and reflect your record-keeping practices. As noted earlier, simple drying is generally allowed under the wild crop scope, as is freezing, in the case of the elderberries here on the slide. Depending on your exact activities, your certifier can determine if your additional handling activities require the handling scope of certification. For example, if you make value-added products that you want to label as organic, more would be required. So this is getting into another scope of certification. If you're using any ingredients or multi-step processing, likely you're handling, and you'd need that additional scope of certification. So there, of course, is a wide variety of activities that may include offsite storage or processing and handling by a third party that's certified organic. So if your crop moves to a different location or is handled by a non-organic entity, it can lose its certified organic status. The intact chain of custody of organic items is very important. So all this just speaks to that record keeping, that movement from the wild crop to the marketplace to where it's being sold. If it's simple, you pick, wash, dry, sell, pretty straightforward chain of records. But if you're selling to another manufacturer that's going to process your items and they're certified organic, and then they give it back to you, and then you sell it from there, fine to do. You just want to have all those steps identified in your system plan. So we can go from fairly simple operations to more complex operations. And with that, we'll bring us up to the top slide. And so this is really the end of my presentation. I want to leave some room for questions here in a moment, but I want to talk a bit more about the resource and those interested in utilizing the TOPP program to become a new certified organic operation. So if you are interested in learning more, you can reach out to our contact here, Hannah, on the screen. She's the lead here at Oregon Tilth, but again, the TOPP program is certifier neutral. So depending on who you want to be certified with, we can hand you off in the appropriate way there. TOPP will provide some free technical assistance and other resources for new applicants that have not been certified before and are looking to transition their enterprises. So I'll leave that contact information up there, and thank you all so much for taking some time today. It's been great to share some of this information about organic certification and wild crops. And we'll pause here for any questions you may have, and I will just stop the share so we can do a little bit of FaceTime here.
Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to chime in using audio, or you're welcome to use the chat feature. I do have a question to start us off. I am curious about the natural resource conservation activities that you mentioned as a requirement for the wild crop harvesting. So say you have a brand new harvester, they're wanting to get into an area that meets all these requirements of it not being contaminated the past 3 years and so on. And they're new to trying to ensure, I think you had water quality listed, soil erosion, pollinator health. If somebody's kind of new to this practice and they're wanting to learn more about how they could enhance those natural resources, do you have any sort of resources or recommendations for a person to get started?
Yeah, that is a good question. And it covers kind of a lot. And I think with this type of program too, some self-research into this is going to be needed. So depending on the harvest site and the requirements. So again, it's really quite vast. You might be harvesting an invasive species that the land management agency that's granted you permission is going to require some sort of management step. If it's an invasive tree that you're peeling the bark from, or an invasive weed, I give the example of like St. John's wort. It may be listed as a noxious weed, and yet you're harvesting the flowers. This may be a good practice to contribute to the sustainability of the environment or that natural ecosystem. Versus, digging out a root along on a shelf above a creek with a pickaxe and several people doing this, and you're digging up half an acre of root, maybe not the best practice because you've exposed topsoil that could be in a highly erodible setting. And so those are kind of two opposite ends of the spectrum and how these activities would occur and their potential impact on the environment. And so we're looking for something kind of in the middle there. Looking at other resources to learn more about this. Yes, I should have had better notes here, but I do have a note here. United Plant Savers, so UPS. So let's put that in the chat. United Plant Savers has some links on their website to sustainable and ethical harvesting, and talks about some of these at-risk plants, and we'll link to other organizations that have more information on that. But I know United Plant Savers is very legit, well regarded, and all of the wild harvest industry. There's a lot of herbalists on the board and people that are involved in conservation. And so I would leave that as a good resource to learn more about different plant types. And they cover, East Coast and West Coast crops. And so that will be a good resource, I think, into learning more about treading lightly here.
Thank you. I'll open it up to anybody else who might have a question or any comments.
And I can just touch back briefly on that in terms of those specific practices. So a lot of the, as an inspector, a lot of the reporting we do is like a checkbox. Yes or no. Did they do this? Did they not do this? Was this matching the OSP? Was it not? When you get to the natural resource conservation section, my inspection report prompts me for narrative comments. We want to describe what a producer's doing or what they're not doing well enough in each of those sections. And so it might be pollinator habitat, soil and water quality, wildlife or impacts on wildlife, any other, let's see, and then just general natural resource, conservation activities. And so for a farm setting, you really want to describe those practices. If they don't have a lot going on, there's some areas of improvement. On the wild crop, it is a little bit different, but we're still tasked with providing those narrative comments. So the inspector is going to ask you questions about your practices and how they might impact while you're out there on site looking at it. Show me some of your harvest areas. Let's talk about impact and leaving enough behind to regenerate, whether it's mushrooms or roots or leaves or flowers you're harvesting. And they'll be making notes to include in their report and actually conducting that physical on-site assessment of what you say you're doing, examples of what you're doing, and then they report that back. And then that is then reviewed by a reviewer to determine if you're meeting the mark or you need to improve one or two aspects. You need to step back from the creek. You wanted to set back 20 feet and it looks like it's too steep of a slope. You may need to set back 50 feet or some other sort of requirement based on evaluating your map, your practices, and the NOP standards and whether they're all congruent or not. And so I think that part of assessing a wild crop producer is really important and will be expounded on in the inspection report as kind of a core part of this part of the certification. I've touched on record keeping and harvest and sales records. Everyone needs to keep that. But for a wild crop producer, assessment of natural resource conservation activities, pretty much the core of what we're there to do. The one thing I didn't get up was like some examples of some documents, examples of that audit trail exercise. But perhaps that's something we can save for a future training on this topic, is showing some real world examples of what those harvest and sales records would look like for interested producers to be able to keep those, because that's a pretty important part of the process as well, that new producers are often not quite ready for understanding the depth of that requirement. And some certifiers will make you provide those records after you harvest. If you've become certified and don't have good examples of record keeping, they'll want to check back in with you sort of mid-year and do an audit exercise of your record keeping to verify you are keeping adequate harvest and sales records.
Thank you, Matthew. We have a question about where and when this webinar will be posted so folks can view it and share it at a later time. So Cameron, this is being recorded and it will be sent out after this training ends sometime today, maybe tomorrow. But as long as you're part of that email list, it will be sent out and the recording will be available on YouTube. If there are no other questions, I can go ahead and wrap this up. Feel free to jump in if you do have anything. Yeah, sure thing, Cameron. Well, yeah, Matthew, I appreciate you joining us and sharing about the wild crop certification process. There's a lot of details, and I'm glad that you could walk us through the different steps. So as we mentioned, this recording will be available to you all. We'll send it out to all who registered for this training, and we'll also send along any resource links as well. If there's nothing else from anyone, I'll go ahead and close this out. And yeah, just thank you again for joining in.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Sydney, and thanks everyone for attending. And you've really keyed into an important um, topic here, and it's really gaining a lot of coverage from the National Organic Program, and other certifiers are looking for additional training opportunities on this topic because it is so nuanced, but important, and becoming more in the focus of certified organic, use the term industry. There's just a lot more awareness around it where it used to be pretty far in the background. So you're right on this cutting edge of identifying it and why it's important and what producers can do to do it right. So thanks for helping to bring this conversation forward.